My name is Drusilla Hartwell, and I am 71 years old. Most people in New Bedford still remember me as Principal Hartwell, the woman who ran her school with equal measures of fairness and steel. I never liked shouting. Quiet authority always carried farther, even in retirement. That habit has stayed with me. When the world around you grows careless, composure becomes its own kind of armor. That afternoon, the sky outside my kitchen window hung low and gray, the kind of coastal weather that presses on your bones. I was finishing my crossword when my phone buzzed on the counter. The message came from my daughter, Seraphine family meeting. 7 p.m., kitchen, no greeting, no explanation, just the command. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside my mug. In this house, there were only 3 of us: Seraphine, her husband Rourke, and me. We had lived together for nearly a year now, ever since they'd claimed a few months to get back on their feet. I didn't answer the text. Instead, I rinsed the coffee pot, filled it again, and laid out 3 cups as if preparing for civility. I chose the chipped blue one for myself. I always do. Habit, I suppose, or maybe superstition. At 7 sharp, the floorboards creaked under Rourke's heavy steps. He appeared first, clean-shaven, polite smile fixed in place. Seraphine followed, phone in hand. Her hair scraped into a tight bun that made her look younger, colder. They didn't sit down. That was my first clue. "We've been talking," she began. Her tone was measured, almost rehearsed. "And we think it's time to discuss contributions." I stirred my coffee once, twice. Contributions, I repeated. Though she wasn't asking for confirmation, Rourke stepped forward, his voice sliding in smoothly, as if they had practiced. "You've been living here rent-free, Mom, and we love having you. But it's only fair that you start pitching in." Seraphine's eyes met mine, bright with something I couldn't name. "Just half your pension," she added. "That's all we're asking." The air thinned between us. For a heartbeat, I heard nothing but the slow tick of the kitchen clock. My pension, the same one that had paid for this roof, these walls. The mortgage cleared 15 years ago. The same pension I had earned through decades of long nights and ungraded papers. I placed my spoon gently on the saucer and looked up. "Half," I said. Rourke nodded, relieved to mistake my calm for compliance. Seraphine leaned back against the counter like someone claiming territory. I smiled, then not warmly, not cruelly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had just seen the shape of something hidden. When they left the kitchen, their voices trailed into the hallway, low and confident. I stayed where I was, staring at the half-empty pot of coffee between us. The house, once so steady, suddenly felt unfamiliar. I poured myself another cup and sat alone at the table. The steam rose in thin ribbons, carrying the faint scent of burnt beans and salt air, and I realized the evening was far from over. The house fell quiet not long after they retreated upstairs. I heard their footsteps fade, the murmur of a door closing, and then nothing, only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of the wind pushing against the window panes. Silence. My oldest companion settled across the kitchen like a thin blanket. I sat there for a while, hands wrapped around the cooling mug. The coffee had gone bitter, but I kept drinking it anyway. It gave my hands something to do while my mind caught up with what had just happened. "Half your pension." The phrase repeated itself in my head, sharp and absurd, like a paper cut that kept reopening. My own daughter, whom I once packed lunches for, defended at parent meetings, and watched sleep through fevered nights, had just turned my retirement into a negotiation. It wasn't the demand that stung most. It was the tone. Calm, organized, reasonable. As though she'd been preparing for weeks. As though I were a line item on a spreadsheet. not the person who taught her to balance one. I looked around the kitchen, the ceramic rooster clock I'd bought with Julian at a roadside market 40 years ago, the sun-faded curtains, the wooden table scratched by generations of use. Every piece had a story, a small proof that I'd built this life with patience and persistence, not charity. Julian used to say, "Don't confuse kindness with obligation. Drew, people will always try." I hadn't thought about that warning in years, but tonight it returned like a bell struck deep inside my chest. He'd been a quiet man, the kind who measured his words and built everything twice once in his mind, once with his hands. When he died, I promised myself I'd do the same, think carefully, build steadily, never depend on someone else to hold what was mine. After the funeral, when the bills piled high and Seraphine was still too young to understand what budget meant, I worked every extra hour the district would give me. I taught summer classes, led evening seminars, even graded state exams for the extra stipend. My pension wasn't luck, it was the compound interest of endurance. I rose from the chair and rinsed the cups. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, followed by laughter, soft, muffled, shared between them. It drifted down like smoke, twisting through the ceiling beams. I turned off the kitchen light. Darkness suited me better tonight. As I moved down the hall, the familiar shape of the house steadied my pulse, the framed diploma, the photo of Seraphine at her high school graduation, her eyes bright with a confidence that once made me proud. She'd wanted to study architecture back then, like her father. Instead, she married one. In the living room, I straightened the stack of unopened mail on the side table. 2 envelopes bore the same return address, her name and Rourke's. I hadn't noticed that before. I slid them beneath a book, promising myself to open them in the morning. The clock struck 11. I switched on the small lamp by the armchair, its amber glow soft against the wallpaper. I picked up my notebook, the one I kept for recipes, household notes, and reminders, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. No decision tonight. Then I underlined it twice. When I finally went upstairs, I paused at the landing. Their door was shut, light spilling faintly beneath it. I turned toward my own room, the smell of sea air drifting through the window cracks. The ocean was only 3 blocks away, invisible but always there like truth, patient and unmovable. I lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dark. The word fair echoed somewhere inside me, dull and persistent. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew this much: something in me had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way tidewater changes the shape of a stone. Morning came slow, gray light slipping through the curtains like an apology. I woke without meaning to, still dressed from the night before, the imprint of worry pressed into every fold of my clothes. Downstairs, the house waited in silence, the kind that asks to be remembered rather than filled. I brewed coffee again, out of habit more than desire, and stood at the sink while it percolated. The smell carried me backward, to another kitchen, another version of this same house. When Julian died, I was 34 and still learning how to live without instruction. He'd left for work one morning, a construction site across the bay, and never came home. An aneurysm, the doctor said later, as if the word could explain how a life could stop between heartbeats. The mortgage was due that Friday. Seraphine was 5. I remember staring at the wall calendar above the phone, wondering what one was supposed to do with both a funeral and a payment deadline in the same week. People told me I was brave. What they meant was that I didn't cry where they could see me. Grief had to fit between work shifts. I took a second job at the community college's registrar's office, and at night I finished my master's in education because I knew that teaching was the only way forward. Every hour had to count. Every dollar had a destination. The house became my project, my anchor. The living room ceiling had a leak that winter. I patched it myself with plastic sheeting and patience. I sanded the floors, painted the trim, and learned to keep a steady hand even when my fingers shook from exhaustion. I fixed what I could and forgave what I couldn't afford to replace. On weekends, Seraphine helped me in small ways, holding a flashlight, sweeping sawdust, handing me nails from an old tin I kept in the cabinet. She thought it was a game. I let her believe that. Childhood should hold at least a few illusions. Each milestone, each payment mailed, each bill stamped aid in full was a form of victory. I used to mark them on the inside of the pantry door in pencil. July 1989. Second mortgage cleared. March 1994, roof replaced. August 1998, kitchen repainted. White with sea glass blue trim. I could open that door even now and trace the faint grooves like rings of a tree trunk. Proof of how time had been earned rather than passed. When Seraphine was 15, I bought her a small desk for her room, solid oak, the first new piece of furniture we'd ever owned. I told her it was for homework, but really it was to teach her that permanence was possible. She'd complained that it was too heavy to move, that her friends had lighter ones made of plastic. That's the point. I said then, the things that last usually are, somewhere along the way. I mistook comfort for understanding. I assumed she'd seen what it took: the late nights, the calluses, the years spent counting coins at the dining table, and that she'd grown to value it. But people forget what they're given too easily when they never had to earn it. I carried my mug to the back door, pushing it open to let in the salt air. The yard was damp from last night's rain. The garden overgrown. Julian's old stone bench still stood beneath the crabapple tree, leaning slightly to one side. The house had settled over the years, the way bodies do, tired in the right places, steady in the rest. This home had shaped me as much as I had shaped it. Every corner knew the rhythm of survival, slow, deliberate, patient. It wasn't wealth that made it mine. It was endurance. Upstairs, the sound of movement began, drawers opening, a voice calling Rourke's name, laughter quick and careless. I listened to it drift down the staircase, then turned back to the window. The light had brightened now, touching the worn surface of the table, the quiet walls that had witnessed both scarcity and strength. I reached for my notebook and wrote down a single line: "This house remembers everything." Then I closed it and began the day. It had been nearly a year since Seraphine and Rourke arrived with their boxes. The day they promised would mark only a short transition period. I remember the morning clearly because the sky was bright in that deceptive way, clear blue, the kind that convinces you nothing terrible can happen under it. Seraphine had called first. Her voice tight, deliberate. "Mom, we've had some bad luck. The landlord's selling the place, and we have to be out by Friday. It's temporary, just until Rourke gets back on his feet." I'd been sitting on the porch with the paper folded on my lap, reading an article about the rising cost of everything: rent, gas, groceries. It was easy to imagine her struggling. I told her, without hesitation, that they could stay here as long as they needed. Even as I said it, something inside me whispered caution, but I smothered it. Mothers always do. When their car pulled into the driveway 2 days later, it looked less like a temporary move and more like a small migration. The trunk was packed high, and the back seat was full of boxes labeled office, kitchen, miscellaneous. Rourke stepped out first, offering a quick smile and a hug that didn't quite reach his shoulders. "We'll be out of your hair in no time," he said, already glancing past me toward the front door. Seraphine followed, sunglasses still on, arms full of houseplants and framed prints. "It's just for a couple of months," she promised. "You won't even notice us." For a while, that was almost true. They kept mostly to themselves, speaking in the polite tones people use when they're still guests. Rourke worked from the dining table, laptop open, telling me about potential clients. Seraphine cleaned the guest room and reorganized the pantry, humming as she worked. I told myself it was nice to have company, that the house hadn't felt so full since Julian was alive. But soon, the rhythm shifted. Rourke started using the living room as an office, spreading papers across the coffee table. Seraphine began buying groceries with my card, saying it was easier to track expenses. The guest room became their room, and every time I walked down the hall, the door that once stayed open was now closed, muffling conversations that ended when I passed. I didn't say anything. It was easier not to. Silence, after all, had kept peace in classrooms full of teenagers for decades. It could hold a household together too, or so I told myself. In the evenings, we sometimes had dinner together, though they often arrived late. Rourke would pour wine. Seraphine would talk about trying new strategies for her freelance projects. I'd nod, ask polite questions, and retreat into washing dishes while they debated investments. It was the kind of conversation that sounded productive, but never led anywhere real. One night, I caught a glance between them, quick, practiced, almost like a signal. I couldn't place its meaning, but it reminded me of a trick students used to pull during exams, a small look that carried a whole plan. I pushed the thought aside. It felt unmotherly to suspect your own child. Weeks turned into months. Seraphine began decorating new curtains, a different rug, little touches that erased my quiet order. Roark repainted the porch railing without asking, saying it needed a modern touch. I thanked him and pretended not to notice the paint streaks on my brick. By winter, they'd stopped mentioning when they might move out. The words temporary and transition disappeared from our conversations entirely. Instead, they spoke about our home, about updating the kitchen, as if the past decades had never happened. Sometimes, I'd wake in the middle of the night and hear them talking downstairs low, deliberate voices over the hum of the heater. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone had changed. It was no longer the soft talk of gratitude, but the clipped rhythm of planning. In the mornings, I'd find coffee grounds spilled on the counter, a pile of unopened mail shifted to the side. Little signs, almost invisible unless you'd lived alone long enough to know how quiet order should feel. Still, I said nothing. I told myself they were family, that patience was love, that trust was a form of faith. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror one evening, I barely recognized the expression looking back, too composed, too careful, the kind of calm that grows over a wound before it's even healed. I turned off the lights, one by one, and listened to the faint sound of laughter from upstairs. It echoed through the beams, bright and foreign, and I realized the house no longer rested the way it used to. It had started to hold its breath. By spring, the rhythm of the house no longer belonged to me. It had shifted, quietly, like furniture moved an inch at a time while I wasn't looking. I still woke early, still brewed my coffee the same way, but I'd begun to notice how every sound I made seemed to interrupt someone else's morning. Roark liked to work from the dining room now. His laptop sat permanently open, flanked by folders and a ring light he claimed he needed for video calls. When I walked through to reach the kitchen, he'd glance up with a polite smile, then say, "Could you try to keep it down, Drusilla?" The mic picks up background noise. The first time, I apologized. The second, I didn't, but I still caught myself tiptoeing past the doorway like a guest in my own home. Seraphine had taken charge of household management, as she called it, bills, insurance notices, bank statements. Everything was redirected to her email. "It's simpler this way," she'd said, tapping her phone as if efficiency were an act of devotion. One afternoon, I noticed a stack of envelopes in the recycling bin, unopened and torn. I smoothed one out on the counter. It was my water bill, addressed to me, the edges damp from a spilled drink. When I asked, Seraphine waved it off. "Oh, I already paid that online. You don't need to worry about it." Worry. The word struck me harder than I expected. I had built my life on the very act of worrying, checking, planning, preparing. To be told not to was like being told to stop breathing. The evenings followed their own pattern. Rourke cooked sometimes meals that used more pans than necessary, always finished with a comment about how this kitchen could really use better lighting. Seraphine sat at the table, scrolling through real estate listings, sighing over houses she couldn't afford but described as the kind of space we deserve. I'd listen from the sink, hands in warm dishwater, letting their words ripple and fade. One night, Roark mentioned repainting the living room, something lighter. He said, "More modern. It would brighten the place." I glanced up from the plate I was drying. "It's fine as it is." He smiled in that patient way people reserve for the elderly. "Sure, but it could use a refresh. We want you to enjoy it too." The word lingered long after he left the room. The small changes accumulated like dust in corners, too subtle to name, too steady to ignore. The family photos I'd arranged along the mantel were shifted to make room for their wedding picture. My books migrated to the upper shelves, replaced by decorative vases. Even the scent of the house changed. My lavender sachets, replaced with citrus candles Seraphine preferred. I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that they were making the space comfortable for everyone. But comfort, I was beginning to learn, was a currency one I no longer controlled. Sometimes, at night, I'd walk through the downstairs rooms before bed, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a frame, the smooth handle of a drawer. It was a small ritual, a way of reassuring myself that something in this house still answered to me. Yet even those gestures began to feel intrusive. Once, I caught Seraphine watching from the staircase, arms folded. "Could you not rearrange things after I've cleaned?" she said softly, without accusation. But the meaning was clear. I nodded. Stepping away from the table I'd set 20 years ago, the air between us was polite, perfectly still, like a room waiting for someone to make the first mistake. When I finally went upstairs, the lights below cast long shadows on the wall lines that didn't quite meet, cracks too fine to measure, but deep enough to spread. The first thing I noticed was the missing envelope. It should have arrived on the first Thursday of the month, a cream-colored statement from the state pension office. I'd received one every 30 days for over a decade, predictable as the tide. That morning, the mailbox held only grocery coupons and an insurance flyer. I waited another day, then another, telling myself delays happened. But when the next envelope arrived a full month later, it had already been slit open. At breakfast, Seraphine was at the counter, stirring her coffee, her phone beside her. "Oh, that came yesterday," she said lightly when I mentioned it. It looked official, so I checked to make sure it wasn't time-sensitive. She said it the way one might talk about straightening a crooked picture frame, helpful, harmless. I thanked her, even as something cold settled in my stomach. That evening, when they were out, I checked the desk drawer in the front hall. It had always been my system bills filed by month, bank correspondence alphabetized. The folders were still there, but they'd been rearranged. The March folder sat behind January. The pen I kept clipped to the inside flap was missing. Someone had gone through them, carefully enough to believe I wouldn't notice. I told myself I was being foolish, that perhaps I'd mixed them up myself. But then the questions started. "Mom," Seraphine said a few mornings later, "do you get your pension through direct deposit or check? I was reading about inflation adjustments. Some retirees get shortchanged without realizing it." "Direct deposit," I said slowly. She nodded, typing something into her phone. "And do you have a beneficiary listed just in case something ever happens?" Roark, across the room, looked up from his laptop. "Yeah. It's smart to keep that updated, he added, tone casual, but his eyes sharp. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was an audit dressed as concern. I could feel it in the pauses between their sentences, the way they watched me when I answered. That afternoon, I sat in my study with the blinds half drawn. The sunlight made a slow pattern across the desk, illuminating the faint dust on the keys of my old calculator. I turned it on, the green display flickering to life, and began checking the past 6 months of deposits against my notebook. Every number matched, but I wrote them down anyway, one column after another, neat and deliberate. When I finished, I added a new entry in the back of the notebook, April 12th. Seraphine asked about pension, inflation. Beneficiary, smile neutral, eyes calculating. The act of writing steadied me. Numbers had never lied to me. People, on the other hand, had learned how. I started keeping track of everything after that, the mail delivery times. Which drawers were slightly ajar? How often Rourke left for client meetings? Even the smallest details mattered now. A week later, I came home from a walk to find my desk chair moved a few inches to the left. The wastebasket beneath it was empty, though I hadn't emptied it myself. On the floor, near the baseboard, was a torn corner of an envelope with my name printed clean across it. I bent to pick it up, folded it once, and slipped it into my pocket. The house was quiet again, but not peaceful. It had begun to feel like a place under observation, mine still, but only just. It happened on a night that began like any other wind against the windows, the faint smell of salt in the air, and that particular stillness that comes when the rest of the world has gone to bed. I had been reading in my room, the same page open for nearly an hour, my eyes tracing the words without meaning. Something in the house felt unsettled, though I couldn't name why. Near midnight, I heard the first sound. A floorboard creaked above, followed by the low murmur of voices. Normally, I would have ignored it. Young people stayed up late. I remembered that rhythm from my teaching years, but the tone was different. Tonight clipped, deliberate. Not the easy chatter of two people unwinding after a day. I set the book aside and listened. Once we get the deed, Seraphine was saying, her voice a whisper but sharp enough to pierce through the ceiling. Then, we'll talk to that memory care place in Lakeview. It's clean, and they let you tour the rooms. There was a pause. A small scrape of a chair. Then Rourke's voice, lower, hesitant. You really think she'll go along with it? She won't have a choice, Seraphine said. Once the paperwork's filed, it'll all be in our name. She can live out her days somewhere safe, supervised. It's better than this. This spoken like a problem, a burden to be managed. I sat perfectly still, feeling the air drain from the room. My own daughter's voice drifted down, soft as smoke, dismantling the life I had built, piece by piece. For a moment, I thought I might have misheard. My mind tried to rearrange the words into something harmless, something maternal, but there was no mistaking the precision in her tone. It wasn't a conversation, it was a plan. I stood, the floor cool beneath my bare feet, and moved to the doorway. The hall was dark except for the faint strip of light from under their door upstairs. I could see their shadows moving against it, quick and restless. Rourke muttered something I couldn't make out, and Seraphine hushed him. Then came the sound of typing, the dull clack of keys. I backed away, each step careful. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I sat on the second step and let the truth settle like sediment in water, ugly, undeniable. They weren't just ungrateful. They were orchestrating my removal. Lakeview. I knew the place. A respectable enough facility near the bay, designed for memory care. I had toured it once years ago when a friend from the library moved there after her diagnosis. Bright halls, pastel walls, and a quiet too perfect to be real. The kind of place that kept people contained. Tidy and forgettable, The thought of them discussing me there, like an inventory item ready for transfer, was almost too much to hold. My pulse steadied only because shock has a strange way of slowing time. I realized I was gripping the banister so tightly that my knuckles ached. Upstairs. Laughter, a soft exhale, followed by the creak of the mattress. The conversation had ended. I rose, crossed the hall to the kitchen, and turned on the small lamp by the sink. The yellow light fell over the counter. The familiar outline of my mug. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in months, the house felt foreign, like a stage set where I'd forgotten my lines. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there until the wind shifted. The oak tree outside brushed against the siding, a sound that used to soothe me. Tonight, it sounded like warning. I thought of Julian, his calm certainty, the way he handled crisis like a craftsman handling tools one at a time. No wasted motion. Don't confuse kindness with obligation, he'd said once. I had spent years ignoring that advice in the name of family. When I finally went back upstairs, I didn't pass their door. I turned instead toward the small room at the end of the hall, the one where I kept my papers and the locked filing cabinet. I flicked on the desk lamp, opened my ledger, and wrote down what I had heard. Word for word. My hand trembled only once. Then I closed the book, turned the key in the lock, and slid it into my pocket. The night outside had gone completely still. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock began to chime the hour. Each note sounded like the beginning of something I could no longer postpone. By dawn, the house was still asleep. I dressed without turning on the overhead light, choosing the gray coat I'd worn to faculty meetings, the one with deep pockets and a dignity I still trusted. In the kitchen, I left the kettle untouched. Coffee could wait. There was work to be done that required a clear head, not warmth. Outside, the air smelled of sea and iron, that New Bedford mixture that clings to memory. I walked to the car slowly, as if any sudden movement might wake the whole street. The morning was cold enough to make my breath visible. For the first time in months, I felt invisible again, in the best way, unwatched. The law office of Marlene Cho sat between a bakery and a shuttered antiques shop, its windows facing the harbor. Marlene had been my attorney for nearly 20 years, long before she became a friend. She'd handled Julian's estate, guided me through refinancing, and helped me set up the first version of my trust. When she opened the door herself, her expression softened into concern. "Drew," she said, ushering me inside. "You're early. That's not like you." "I didn't sleep," I replied. Her office smelled faintly of citrus polish and paper. A brass lamp on her desk cast a narrow circle of light over a stack of open files. She gestured for me to sit. "Tell me," she said simply. I didn't rush. Words are like glass. Drop them too fast and they shatter. I told her everything: the missing mail, the questions about my pension, the whisper through the ceiling about Lakeview. I spoke evenly, watching the shift in her eyes, not surprise, but calculation. Marlene had seen too many families blur the line between help and harm to ever dismiss a story like mine. When I finished, she leaned back, hands folded. "You did the right thing coming here first," she said. "We'll make sure they can't touch a cent or a square foot." Her efficiency steadied me. She pulled a thin folder from her cabinet labeled Hartwell, Drusilla Revocable Trust, its edges neatly tabbed. "We'll amend this," she continued, "to remove any contingent beneficiaries. You'll remain sole trustee and owner. The deed to the property will reflect that no co-signers, no transfer on death clause, everything in your name only." She began typing, the sound crisp, rhythmic. "And your pension direct deposit," I said. "Then we'll reroute it to a new account, new bank, new credentials, with a passcode only you know. I'll have the forms ready before lunch." Her words moved like clockwork, precise and merciful. I found myself breathing easier. Do you want to designate anyone else for later? She asked gently. A secondary trustee. I shook my head. No. If something happens to me, I'd rather it go where it can help strangers than enable family who stopped being one. She didn't argue. She only nodded, her pen scratching quietly across the amendment page. When the paperwork was ready, she slid it toward me. The pages smelled faintly of toner and ink. Fresh beginnings always do. I signed where she pointed, the motion deliberate, my signature steady. Each stroke felt like stitching a torn seam closed. Marlene gathered the papers, placed them in a manila envelope, and sealed it with the press of her palm. I'll file this today, she said. You'll get certified copies by the end of the week. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor. The sound was harsh but alive. Drew, she said finally, this isn't revenge. It's protection. There's a difference. I know, I said, but sometimes protection feels like reclaiming oxygen. She smiled faintly, then breathed. By the time I left the office, the sun had climbed higher, the harbor throwing shards of light across the car windshield. I sat for a moment before starting the engine, watching the glint on the water. It reminded me of the brass lamp on Marlene's desk, the small, unwavering light that had cut through my fear. When I turned the key, the engine caught on the first try. For once, the sound didn't jar me, it steadied me. The road home curved along the water, familiar yet changed. Every turn, every shadowed house, felt sharper now, as if the world itself had been waiting for me to stop tolerating and start preparing. By noon, I would have copies of my future sealed under my own name, and for the first time in months, I would eat lunch without tasting fear. For the rest of that week, I became an actress in my own home. The trick, I discovered, was not to change anything. People grow suspicious of sudden warmth, but they trust consistency like oxygen. So I kept my tone even, my footsteps steady. My hands busy with familiar things, watering the plants, folding laundry, setting the table just so. Seraphine mistook my calm for fatigue. You've been so quiet lately. Mom, she said one morning as she poured herself tea. Maybe you should take it easy. Rourke and I have been talking about freshening up the place. Anyway, some updates that would take the weight off you. Updates, I asked. Stirring honey into my cup. She smiled, all composure and confidence. Oh, just little things for now. New paint. Maybe refinishing the floors. We were thinking of opening up the kitchen, eventually. You know, make it brighter. I nodded, hiding the twitch of a muscle behind a sip of tea. The kitchen she wanted to open up was the same one I had rebuilt with my own hands after Julian died. Scraping paint from walls until my fingers bled. I didn't remind her. Let her think the world began when she started noticing it. Rourke joined us a few minutes later. Laptop under his arm. A faint smell of cologne trailing behind him. Morning, ladies, he said easily, leaning against the counter. I was just reading about something that might help with property taxes, a transfer on death deed. Have you heard of it? Drusilla. It's a simple form, really. Avoids probate. Saves time later. I met his eyes over the rim of my cup. Sounds efficient. It is, he said quickly, encouraged. Basically, you can name someone family, of course, who automatically gets the property when, you know, the time comes. No lawyers, no delays. It's a win-win. Seraphine's hand brushed his arm. The kind of touch that finishes a sentence without words. I smiled faintly. You'll have to show me the article sometime. He relaxed, mistaking civility for interest. I watched them share a look, brief, silent, practiced. Then Seraphine turned back to her phone, already scrolling through renovation ideas, narrating colors and designs that had nothing to do with my taste. I stood, carried my cup to the sink, and rinsed it carefully. The porcelain clinked softly against the metal, steady as a heartbeat. Their voices blurred behind me, phrases like property value and inheritance tax floating through the air, harmless to anyone who hadn't lived long enough to recognize the shape of manipulation. I let them talk. I even leaned over to glance at the photos on Seraphine's screen, open floor plans, granite counters, cheerful lighting. Lovely, I said, and meant it in the way one admires a painting before turning away. Later that afternoon, while they argued over measurements in the living room, I sat in the sunroom with a notebook balanced on my knees. The light fell across the page in thin stripes. I wrote down every word they'd said, each number Rourke mentioned, each detail of their imagined future. Not because I needed proof Marlene's paperwork had already ensured my safety, but because writing it made me steady. When they finally left for an evening walk, I closed the notebook and set it beside the teapot. The air in the house was still again, almost gentle. I could hear the slow tick of the mantel clock, counting down minutes in a home that no longer belonged to pretense, even if I still had to play the part a little longer. It began with a drawer, a small one, second from the top of my writing desk, the one where I kept stamps, notepads, and the brass letter opener Julian had given me our first Christmas together. I noticed it as soon as I sat down that morning. The drawer wasn't quite flush with the frame, as though it had been opened and closed in haste. When I pulled it out, the contents looked the same at first glance. But the order was wrong. The stamps that always sat on the left were now stacked neatly on the right. The letter opener lay at a sharper angle than I ever left it. I'd always been meticulous about such things. Years of grading essays had trained my eye to notice details: the misaligned margin, the missing period. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. I stood there a moment, the quiet hum of the house pressing around me. Sunlight slid across the floorboards, touching the edges of the safe that sat discreetly beneath the window. It was small, gray, and heavy enough to resist curiosity, or so I had thought. But even from across the room, I could see it just slightly turned, the way a chair might look after someone rises from it too quickly. I knelt and ran my fingers along the metal. The lock dial was off-center by a single notch. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been nothing. But then I saw the tea canisters. I kept them lined up by color on the counter: green for mint, blue for chamomile, white for black tea. The morning light had always caught their lids in a way that pleased me. Now, the blue one faced backward. The white one's lid crooked. Someone had been here. Someone comfortable enough to move through my spaces, confident enough to believe I wouldn't notice. The air shifted in my chest. Not fear, exactly, but something quieter, denser. I'd felt it once before. Years ago, when I returned to the classroom after discovering a student had copied an entire essay, that mix of disappointment and certainty, you knew they had done it. And they knew you would find out. I went to the hall closet and retrieved a small notebook, the one I used to track grocery lists. Now, repurposed. I sat at the kitchen table, drew a line across the top of a blank page, and began to record 8:42 a.m. Desk drawer misaligned, contents shifted, 8:44 a.m. Safe turned slightly. Dial off center, 8:46 a.m. Tea canisters disturbed. The act of writing steadied me. Each word felt like a brick laid carefully in a wall I could rebuild later, should I need to. When I finished, I reached for the phone and dialed the number from the sticker on the side of my back door: Ramos Lock and Key, S. 1972. The same man had installed the locks after Julian died. His son answered now. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, voice bright, respectful. "I remember the house. Still on Hawthorne Street." "Yes," I replied. "I'd like to schedule a service, new locks. All doors. How soon you need it? Today, if possible." He hesitated. Any issue I should know about, I paused, letting the silence settle before answering. Just age, I said finally. Things wear down. He promised to send someone by noon. I hung up and returned to my desk. The safe sat silent, indifferent. I didn't open it. I only straightened it back into place and wiped my fingerprints from the dial. Some boundaries don't need to be checked. They need to be redefined. When the locksmith arrived, a young man in a Navy uniform, I greeted him at the door as though nothing were unusual. "The bolts are sticking," I said. He nodded, carrying his tools inside with quiet competence. As he worked, the metallic click of his drill echoed softly through the house, steady, precise, cleansing. When he finished, he handed me the new keys, each one marked with a small brass tag. "Fresh locks." He said, "No copies unless you ask." "Good," I said, slipping them into my pocket. "That's exactly what I need." After he left, I stood in the doorway, watching the light stretch across the porch. The air smelled faintly of metal and salt, the scent of something reclaimed. I closed the door and turned the key once, then again, listening to the solid click of the latch. It was a sound I hadn't realized I'd been missing, a sound that said, "For now, this space was mine again." They left on a Friday morning, a rush of car doors and impatient voices. Seraphine called out from the driveway, "We'll be back Sunday. Traffic's awful this time of year." Rourke loaded the last bag into the trunk and gave a two-finger wave without meeting my eyes. The sound of the engine faded down the street until only the gulls remained, circling above the rooftops. For a long moment, I stood at the window, the house settling into silence around me. The air felt different, lighter, though edged with something electric. I made a pot of coffee, poured a cup, and placed it on the counter beside the folded set of new keys the locksmith had left. The time had come to stop recording and start removing. I began with the doors. Each lock turned easily beneath my hands, the new brass smooth and certain. The metallic clicks marked a quiet rhythm as I moved from front to back, then side entrance, each sound a punctuation to months of endurance. I taped the old keys together, dropped them into an envelope, and wrote "expired" across the front before sliding it into a drawer. Upstairs, their room smelled faintly of perfume and cologne, too much of both. I opened the curtains, letting daylight flood in, and started packing. Rourke's suits went first, then Seraphine's dresses, the expensive kind she claimed were discount finds. I folded everything neatly, not out of kindness, but order. The room looked calmer as each box filled, as if the walls could breathe again. In the closet, I found a stack of unopened mail with my name on it, credit card offers, a utility bill, 2 envelopes from the bank. I added them to the pile on the desk, scanned them into my records, then sealed them away in my own filing cabinet. Every trace of me they had tried to appropriate, I reclaimed. When the boxes were done, I moved them into the garage, stacked 3 high under a tarp, 2 names written in black marker, Seraphine and Rourke. Nothing broken, nothing discarded, just removed. Beside them, I left a folded note that read, "Only collect when convenient. Door will be unlocked by appointment." At my desk, I opened my accounting software. Old habits die in orderly ways. I entered every expense I'd covered since the day they moved in: utilities, groceries, repairs, the repainting they had promised to pay for but never did. The total climbed line by line, a small fortune disguised as domestic kindness. When I finished, I printed the ledger, slipped it into a labeled envelope, and added another beside it, a notarized eviction notice dated that morning. Both went into the mailbox at the curb, their corners perfectly aligned. The afternoon light slanted across the yard as I returned to the porch. The sea wind carried a faint chill, stirring the edges of my coat. I sat on the steps with the last of my coffee and watched the street return to stillness. Inside, The house felt new again, unburdened. No raised voices, no footsteps echoing overhead, only the sound of the old clock marking time. I locked the front door one final time, tested the handle, and exhaled. It clicked shut with a certainty that felt almost like peace. The first message arrived just after noon on Monday. The subject line read, "Proof of Transfer Property Agreement." I nearly deleted it, thinking it was spam, but the sender's name stopped me cold. Seraphine Vale. The email was short, efficient, like one of her text messages. "Mom, just so everything's official between us. Attaching the gift agreement from March. You already signed. This is just confirmation for your records. Love you." There was a PDF attached. I clicked it. The document bore the letterhead of a local notary service I recognized, though the address was 3 years out of date. Beneath a heading in bold, "Property Gift Agreement, 50%, Ownership Transfer," was a version of my signature that looked nearly perfect. The angle was right, the looping D the same, but the spacing between letters was wrong. Whoever had copied it had done so from memory, not muscle. My breath came steady, not sharp. Shock had become a language I could now read fluently. I studied the rest of the page dates, formatting, the supposed witness signature, someone named R. Penn. I closed the file and forwarded it immediately to Marlene Cho, adding only 3 words, "Forgery, please advise." Then I printed the document, slipped it into a folder marked "Evidence," and sat back. The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly, almost mocking in its normalcy. I turned it off and reached for the phone instead. The next call came less than an hour later. Mrs. Hartwell. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "This is Claire from Harbor State Bank's Fraud Department. We're calling to verify a refinance application submitted this morning using your property address. We noticed some discrepancies." I felt something settle in me, a cold alignment. "I didn't submit any application," I said. "I see," the woman replied, her tone careful now. "The request listed your name and social security number, but the contact email is different. Mercer, Finances." She paused. "That's not you, is it?" "No," I said quietly. "That's my son-in-law." There was a pause long enough for meaning to bloom between us. "We'll freeze the process immediately," she said. "Would you like to file a formal fraud report?" "Yes," I answered. "Right now." She walked me through the steps, patient and precise. When we hung up, she promised written confirmation within the hour. I thanked her and stayed on the line a moment longer, listening to the dial tone, the hum of distance. Then I placed the receiver down as though it were something fragile. Outside, the sky had turned the color of dull pewter, heavy with the threat of rain. I moved through the house slowly, collecting the day's mail from the porch, sorting it methodically, habit as armor. There were 2 credit offers, one circular, one utility bill. I stacked them neatly, checked the locks again, and returned to my desk. In the quiet, I opened my notebook and wrote Monday, 1:14 p.m. Email from Seraphine. Forged signature, 2:03 p.m. Bank call. Fraudulent refinance attempt. Report filed. Then I capped my pen, smoothed the page, and let the silence close around me. The fear that once came in waves no longer did. It sharpened instead, like glass ground into clarity. Some battles announce themselves with shouting, others with the sound of a single email landing in your inbox. The certified letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, the kind that looks official before you even read the seal. The mailman, a polite man named Curtis, who always waved from the gate, hesitated before handing it to me. "Looks important," he said. The envelope was thick, stamped with the county clerk's insignia. Inside were 2 neatly clipped documents and a cover sheet titled, "Request for Durable Power of Attorney." filed April 17th. At first, I thought it was another clerical mistake, perhaps a duplicate of something Marlene had already filed during the trust update. But then I saw the applicant's name printed in confident block letters, Seraphine Vale. My own name followed, labeled Proposed Principal Incapacitated. Attached beneath it was a typed physician's note. Short and falsely clinical, patient exhibits signs of mild cognitive decline and confusion. May require financial oversight. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Liana Whitaker. The name rang a faint bell. It took me a moment to place it. Rourke's cousin. The one who had come to dinner months ago, quiet, polite, barely speaking. She had signed her name beneath a paragraph that declared me incompetent to manage my own affairs. The edges of the page trembled between my fingers. Not from fear, but fury measured so precisely it steadied me. I read the document twice, then a third time. Every sentence was an accusation wrapped in bureaucracy. Every word meant to erase me politely. They weren't just after the house now. They were after the right to speak in my name. I set the papers down, folded my hands on the table, and waited for the anger to sharpen into something useful. When it did, I reached for the phone and called the New Bedford Police Department. The voice on the line transferred me to Officer Latham, a man whose tone was both brisk and kind. "Let's start from the top," he said after I explained. "Bring everything you have, the letter, any supporting evidence. We'll make it official." An hour later, I sat in a small, neat office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. The blinds were half open, sunlight cutting stripes across the floor. Officer Latham was in his early 50s, with a calm that came from years of listening to stories worse than mine. He adjusted his glasses as I handed over the documents. "You said the physician is a relative of your son-in-law." "Yes. She's never examined me. She came for dinner once." He whistled softly under his breath. "That's bold." He began typing notes into his report. "We'll log this as an attempt at legal manipulation and falsified medical documentation. Do you have prior incidents involving the same individuals?" I slid my evidence folder across the desk. Photocopies of the forged gift agreement, the bank correspondence, the fraud report confirmation. "Same people," I said. He flipped through the pages, nodding as he read. "Good documentation. Most people don't think to do this until it's too late. I used to be a principal," I said. "Paper trails save lives." He smiled faintly. "They still do. You'll get a case number by tomorrow. I'll file this with the County Fraud Division as well." As he spoke, I realized my hands had stopped trembling entirely. The sound of his keyboard filled the silence steady, deliberate. Each keystroke a small act of repair. When he finished, he stood and extended his hand. "You did the right thing. It's better to act now than wait for them to make the next move." "I'm done waiting," I said. Outside, the sunlight had warmed. The harbor wind carried the scent of salt and diesel from the docks, grounding and familiar. I walked to my car, placed the evidence folder on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment before turning the key. Grief had burned itself out. What remained wasn't sorrow but focus, a clarity sharp enough to draw blood if misused. Back home, I filed the police receipt into the front of my binder, where it joined every other document I had protected. The house was quiet, the air clean from the morning's breeze. I locked the drawer, checked it twice, and placed the key around my neck on a thin chain. They had tried to write me out of my own life, but I had learned, long ago, how to keep records that spoke louder than anyone's version of me. I sent the message early Sunday morning. Family dinner, 6 o'clock, just us. Seraphine replied within minutes, an emoji of a heart and a knife and fork. Rourke didn't respond at all. All afternoon, I moved through the house in measured silence. I wiped the table, dusted the lamp, and brewed tea I didn't plan to serve. There would be no meal this time. No pleasantries or pretense. Only the truth. Waiting neatly beneath 2 manila folders placed side by side in the center of the table. By 6! The light outside had softened to the gray blue of approaching evening. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and rain. I sat at the head of the table, hands folded, back straight. The same chair I had once used to preside over birthdays, Christmas dinners. Arguments now felt like a witness stand. At 6:08, tires crunched on the gravel drive. Voices, laughter that sounded forced. The front door opened without a knock. "Smells good," Seraphine said automatically as she stepped inside, scanning the room for a meal that didn't exist. Rourke followed, holding a bottle of wine he hadn't thought to open. "Sit," I said. They exchanged a look. Hers puzzled. His wary but obeyed. The moment they did, the balance shifted. I slid the first folder toward them. "That," I said, "is a restraining order. It's been signed and filed. It prohibits you from entering this property or contacting me directly." Seraphine blinked. "Mom, what is this?" Her laugh was brittle. "You're being dramatic." Rourke said nothing. "You wanted to talk about fairness?" I continued. "This is fair." Before she could speak, I opened the second folder and turned it around. "This one's a civil fraud complaint. It covers your forged gift agreement, the refinance attempt in my name, and the power of attorney request supported by a falsified medical document." Rourke leaned forward. "You can't prove yes." "I can," I said. I reached for the small recorder beside my teacup and pressed play. The sound filled the room. Seraphine's voice, unmistakable. "Once we get the deed, we'll talk to that memory care place in Lakeview. It's clean." And they let you tour the rooms. The playback ended. The silence afterward was thick enough to feel. Rourke swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. Seraphine stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You set us up," she said. "You twisted everything. We were just trying to help you plan for the future." I met her eyes evenly. "You mistook ownership for opportunity." Her voice rose, trembling with something between fury and panic. "You're going to regret this. You bitter old enough," Rourke said quietly. His voice broke on the word. He stood too, slower this time, and touched her arm, but she pulled away. "You've made your choice," I said, "and I've made mine. The law will sort out the rest." Seraphine glared at me, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "You'll die alone in this house." She spat. "Perhaps," I said softly, "but I'll die in peace." She stormed toward the door, Rourke following close behind, saying nothing. The slam of the door echoed down the hall, then the sound of the car engine fading into the wet air. I stayed seated, letting the quiet expand until it became something almost sacred. The folders still lay open on the table, their contents illuminated under the lamp's glow, proof not of vengeance, but of boundaries reclaimed. When I finally rose, I gathered the papers, locked them away, and poured myself a cup of tea. The house was utterly still, save for the ticking of the hallway clock. It sounded, at last, like justice. Seraphine's voice rose before she even reached the door. "You think this is over," she shouted, the words cracking at the edges. "You can't just erase us." Rourke stood behind her, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't say a word. The man who once filled every silence with explanations now had nothing left to defend. "You've made a fool of yourself," she went on, trembling. "Do you know how this looks? What people will say when they find out. I imagine they'll say I finally learned to listen to myself." I replied. My voice sounded foreign, almost detached, as if someone older and steadier had borrowed it. Roark touched her arm. "Let's go," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken all evening. She jerked away, tears bright in her eyes, and glared at me like she was trying to memorize my face One last argument she couldn't win. Then, with a choked sound that was neither word nor sob, she turned and walked out. The door slammed once. Then again, as Rourke followed. Their footsteps echoed down the porch, fading into the wet night. I stood there until the sound of their car dissolved into the hum of distant traffic. The house trembled faintly, then settled. It felt like the exhale of a place that had been holding its breath for too long. For a while, I simply moved through the rooms, touching what they had. Touched the back of a chair, the cold edge of the countertop, the banister polished by years of hands that once belonged to my family, the quiet pressed close, heavy but not cruel. On the table, the lamp still glowed. The two folders lay closed, their shadows stretching across the wood like a line drawn between the past and the present. I picked them up, slid them into the drawer of my desk, and turned the key. Only then did my body loosen. My knees bent, my hands fell open, and the tears came not loud, not theatrical, just a slow, soundless release. They weren't for Seraphine or Rourke, or even for what we'd lost. They were for the woman who had stayed silent too long and finally found the strength to speak. When the sobs subsided, I wiped my face with the back of my hand, straightened my shoulders, and looked around. The house, emptied of noise, seemed to pulse with something living again. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin breeze slipped through the window and carried the faint scent of salt and lilac. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. It felt like beginning. The next morning, the quiet no longer hurt. It hummed, soft and steady, like something mending itself. Sunlight spilled through the front windows, washing over the furniture that had survived every storm, mine included. I started with the walls. The cream paint Seraphine once called too plain had yellowed with time, so I covered it with a cool, soft gray. The brush moved with a rhythm that felt almost meditative. With each stroke, I erased a fingerprint, a shadow, a memory that no longer belonged here. When the paint dried, I replaced the curtains. Gone were the patterned ones she'd insisted made the house feel younger. In their place hung pale linen, thin enough to let the morning light breathe through. The breeze carried the scent of salt and damp wood, whispering through the folds like relief. The next task was order. I gathered every legal document trust, property deed, bank records, and placed them neatly into labeled envelopes. They went into the small, fireproof safe, the one tucked behind the bookshelf. I turned the key and pressed my palm against the cool metal. For the first time, the act didn't feel defensive. It felt deliberate, sacred, like closing a door that would never need to be reopened. Outside, the lilacs were blooming again. I trimmed a few stems, placed them in a glass jar, and set them by the window. Their scent filled the air, sharp but clean, and it struck me that healing often smells like effort, a reminder that peace isn't passive, it's practiced. That afternoon, I stopped by the New Bedford Public Library to return a stack of books. Near the bulletin board, a woman in her 60s stood frowning at a pamphlet about retirement scams. Her confusion reminded me of so many others I'd known, women who had worked hard all their lives, only to be told, too late, that their security depended on someone else's honesty. On impulse, I asked to speak with the librarian, a kind man named Oliver who wore tweed even in spring. Within a week, the library scheduled a pilot class financial confidence for retired women. 10 women came to the first session. Some took notes diligently, others simply listened. I taught them how to read a statement line by line, how to recognize manipulation dressed as concern, how to keep their independence in ink, not just intention. When the class ended, one woman lingered to say, You make it sound like freedom is a skill. It is, I told her, but it can be learned. That night, back home, the walls gleamed under lamplight. The air was light, the silence kind. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window as dusk settled over the harbor. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt earned. The morning light slid gently over New Bedford Harbor. The kind of light that forgives what it touches. The gulls were loud today, circling the fishing boats already pulling away from the docks, their cries cutting through the hum of early traffic. I sat on the porch with my first cup of coffee black. No cream, no sugar. Just the way Julian used to drink it. And the way I'd learned to like it once softness became a luxury I could no longer afford. The porch boards were warm under my bare feet. I'd refinished them last month with help from a neighborhood boy named Caleb, who worked for cash and listened more than he spoke. He'd asked once if I lived alone. I'd said, not anymore. And he'd nodded as if that made perfect sense. Across the street, Mrs. Duval was watering her window boxes, the same ones she's tended since her husband's heart gave out 5 summers ago. She caught my eye and waved. I lifted my cup in reply. The gesture felt simple, unburdened, like breathing after a long-held note. On the small table beside me sat a sealed envelope, the final copy of the trust documents Marlene had sent last week. Inside were the words that now defined my life, my house, my pension, my peace. Everything rerouted, simplified, safeguarded. If anything happened to me, it would go not to family, but to a scholarship fund for women over 60 returning to school. A quiet rebellion against everything I'd been told about what age and independence should mean. I watched the light crawl across the harbor, catching the water in thin ribbons of gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to plan or prepare. There were no schemes to guard against, no voices rising through the ceiling, no locks to check twice. Just stillness, the kind that hums low and certain, like a house that finally recognizes its owner again. Later this morning, I would walk to the library for another class. The women who came each week brought pastries and stories, trading fears for laughter, numbers for confidence. They reminded me that survival wasn't an ending. It was the foundation for everything that came after. I took another sip of coffee and closed my eyes against the sun. Somewhere behind me, the old clock inside the house struck 8. Each chime landed softly, steady and sure. Freedom, I thought, wasn't something anyone ever handed you. It was practiced one boundary at a time, one signature, one quiet refusal to be erased. The air smelled of salt and lilac, sharp and alive. I stayed there until the light grew too bright to look at, holding the cup between my palms, listening to the steady rhythm of the harbor, proof that peace, when it finally arrives, doesn't whisper, it stays.